From the Historyogi Podcast, this is Dave. Hindutva, the predominant form of Hindu nationalism in India, has emerged as a powerful and polarizing force. Hindutva aims to ultimately transform India from a secular republic into a Hindu state. Since the election of Narendra Modi in 2014, followers of Hindutva have become bolder in targeting minorities and critics with intimidation and violence. These tensions have also affected the global Indian diaspora. Today, we speak to Mohan Dutta, Dean's Chair Professor of Communication and Director of the Center for Culture Centered Approach to Research and Evaluation at Massey University, on the reasons behind Hindutva's surge in prominence and what this means for Indians who defend secular values and religious pluralism. Thanks so much, Prof. Mohan, for joining me today. To start, what is Hindutva fundamentally about and what are its goals?
Thank you for having me. First of all, it's a pleasure to be in this conversation. We have seen each other and interacted on social media, so it's really good to connect face to face. So Hindutva is a political ideology that constructs the idea of India on the notion of a Hindu nation, or what it defines as Hindu Rashtra. And the notion of the Hindu nation is organized around sort of two key concepts. One is the idea of a monolithic Hindu culture or Sanskriti, and a Hindu jati or race.
Why has Hindu nationalism become so dominant in India over the last decade?
So if you look at the history of Hindu nationalism and this idea of a monolithic Hindu nation, this really goes back to colonial times. And you have to think about the 1920s, right around the time when fascism was on the rise globally. Hindutva ideologues drew on this idea of the constructing of a race-based nation and formulated this principle of Hindu Rashtra. So Hindutva, if you think about it as a large umbrella, it incorporates within it a wide range of organizations. You have organizations like the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh or the RSS, the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, the VHP, and you have far more right-wing Hindutva organizations as well, such as the Ram Sena, which are and have been involved in various forms of organizing of violence, and actually so have VHP and RSS as well. And then within this Hindutva umbrella, you have a mainstream political party, the Bharatiya Janata Party or the BJP. Now, if you think about the rise of Hindutva into India's mainstream or so-called mainstreaming of Hindutva into Indian politics, you can really think about the mid-1990s as the time when Hindutva became visible. And it happened through the organizing of large populations of Hindus under this logic of being mobilized for the Hindu nation around the destruction of the Babri Masjid. Now, the Babri Masjid is a mosque which is articulated by Hindutva ideologues as the birthplace of Lord Ram. Now, one of the things that is worth establishing here is that there is really no empirical evidence per se to substantiate this articulation that indeed is the birthplace of Lord Ram. What you instead have is politics organized around marking that mosque as the birthplace of Lord Ram, and then articulating this argument or this narrative that barbaric Muslim invaders came in and destroyed the temple and instead built a mosque. So the organizing of Hindutva in the mid 1990s, particularly with the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, was built around then getting people to come together in this procession, which is called the Rath Yatra. And you had Kar Sevaks, people who would gather together from various parts of India, coming to Ayodhya, the place of Babri Masjid, to dismantle mosque. Now, this was an incredibly powerful moment in terms of public discourse because it foregrounded in the public arena this notion of Hindu mobilization to formulate an image of the nation based upon Hindu mythology, if you will. So, since the 1990s, then we have seen the gradual ascendance of Hindutva. And then what happened in 2015 or so is, the arrival on the national landscape of Narendra Modi as an organizing figure for Hindutva gave another layer of boost to the Hindutva movement and really sort of catapulted it to hegemony.
You've written about how closely Hindutva is linked to Islamophobia. Why are Muslims in particular a target?
Now, let's go back to the question of the origin of Hindutva in the 1920s. So if you think about it as a political project, the building of this notion of the Hindu Rashtra was based upon two ideas. Then one is the marking of the outsider, and the outsider specifically being the Muslim other or the Muslim invader. So, the sanctity of the Hindu nation in that sense was constructed as being at risk because of Muslim invasion. And simultaneously, something else also is at work here, which is the erasure of caste inequalities and ongoing colonization and oppression of Adivasi or India's indigenous people, as both Adivasis and Dalits or oppressed caste communities are incorporated or folded into the Hindutva structure. In the sort of post-mid 1990s period, something else that you saw happen globally is with 9/11 particularly, the rise of Islamophobia and in many ways the mainstreaming of Islamophobia into politics, into the organization of the security intelligence communities. And this really worked hand in hand with Hindutva in the sense that it gave Hindutva another boost in terms of its Islamophobic elements. So, you have something you see globally, and it's quite interesting in the contemporary context, is the ways in which the Islamophobia of Hindutva intersects with the Islamophobia of white supremacists. And, in a lot of the work that I do in terms of tracking online discourses and the ways in which Islamophobia is constructed in these online discourses, the thing I find quite striking is the ways in which Islamophobia of Hindutva groups piggybacks on and connects with white supremacist Islamophobia. So I will give you an example. When we had the Lynn Mall attack here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, which was a lone person with sort of an ISIS ideology, launching an attack in a mall. The immediate response on the Twitter sphere was one of Islamophobia, that this is how Muslims are and this is what their characteristics are. And the thing that was most striking is that these attacks were coming from Hindutva ideologues who were saying that this is what Hindus have had to deal with Muslims for centuries. And this is, again, a reflection of that. And then again, that was being picked up by white supremacist groups. And in fact, in the short analysis that I did in terms of the percentage of Twitter posts that were Islamophobic coming from different accounts, the large majority were Hindutva-related Islamophobia.
Hindu nationalists are not shy about their disdain for academics, activists, and intellectuals, and have actively targeted them, including yourself, in harassment campaigns. Why go after these groups specifically?
So again, the thing I want to say here is that the phenomenon that you see here in terms of the targeting of academics, poets, activists, anyone that is vocal about this kind of hate infrastructure, actually again runs parallel to sort of the Trumpist movement in the US or the Bolsonaro kind of movement in Brazil. So, or if you think about Duterte in the Philippines. And I think, one of the key aspect of this kind of strongman politics is the mobilization of a very large scale hate infrastructure to support this kind of authoritarian mode of governmentality. So in that sense, authoritarianism is propped up and supported by populism. So you have, in fact, form of electoral democracy, if you will, that is majoritarian, and at its core is undemocratic in terms of deploying a majoritarian politics to set up and reproduce various forms of silencing of dissent, of protest, of critique. So the reason in that sense why academics, activists are being targeted by Hindutva is that Hindutva seeks to silence any voice that critiques it. Academic institutions, universities have been attacked. Hindutva ideologues have been set up as the administrators or managers of some of these universities, which actually then has worked to actively silence dissent. Students that have been dissenting have been targeted. We have a number of activists and academics that are currently incarcerated in India. And then we also have the targeting of journalists, the journalists such as Gauri Lankesh, who was assassinated by Hindutva forces. So, even though I have faced ongoing attacks over the last few months, I think that the scale of those attacks are not even comparable to the kinds of attacks you see happen in India. But at the heart of these attacks is this objective of Hindutva to silence any critical voice. But, something else then that has happened connected to this targeting of dissenting voices in India is that, Hindutva organizations have figured out that it's much harder to control voices that are outside of India. So within that context, then, there's been a lot of organizing of Hindutva, precisely trying to then figure out how do you silence the voices that are outside of India, that are in the Indian diaspora, that are actually critiquing Hindutva. And in that sense, Hindutva is quite smart. So in the diaspora, it appeals to multiculturalism. So whether it is in the US or in Australia or in Aotearoa, New Zealand, it positions itself as minority religious group, and then it says that its religious freedom is being threatened, by those of us that are critiquing Hindutva, and therefore it tries to label that critique as hate speech. So it's a really interesting move in that sense, if you will, that a political ideology that is fundamentally built upon hate deploys that language of hate speech in democracies in order to target academics and dissenting voices.
Why has social media been such a powerful tool for Hindu nationalists to spread their messages?
If you look at the architecture of social media depend upon virality, the ability to go viral. Now, you have to ask, what kind of content lends itself to going viral? And, there is substantive research that argues that it is hate content It is content that is driven by disinformation, but that is also able to catalyze hate that lends itself to going viral. In fact, Facebook's own studies have demonstrated that hate content has much greater likelihood to go viral. So that characteristic of digital media that lends itself to the spread of disinformation and for the disinformation to go viral, then becomes the basic architecture underlying hate politics, such as white supremacy and Hindutva. So again, if you were to ask the question, if you look at the Capitol Hill attack in the US and then compare it to Hindutva, what you would see is that the phenomena are quite connected in the sense that they draw upon the power of platforms to drive up both disinformation and hate. Something else, therefore, I want to point out is that because hate is profitable, social media platforms, digital platforms, do very little to contain that hate and to actually develop strategies to address it. And I will give you one example to elucidate this. When COVID started in India, the first round of COVID outbreaks in India, you saw proliferation of Islamophobic messages that were arguing, there were memes, there were poster images, there were limericks, short stories crafted, which were all suggesting that Muslims are spreading the COVID virus because they want to attack Hindus. Now, the thing that was so striking about that was that that information would accelerate itself in the ways in which it would spread, and it would do so across platforms. So its ability to jump from one platform to the other and then back into the platform. And in that process, it would continue to magnify itself. So you had, for instance, images of Muslims spitting on food and then distributing the food. And those images would be picked up, for instance, on Twitter. But from Twitter, they would make their way into WhatsApp feeds. And then pretty soon, they would get into familial networks and into familial conversations. And what you have here, therefore, is this capacity of disinformation to fuel hate without actually the mechanisms for someone to jump into that conversation and say that, hey, wait a minute, let's actually question this piece of information that is being circulated. So something that's quite alarming within the context of India then is that the way in which this kind of hate, as it jumps from one platform to the other, actually is able to mobilize mobs. So we have seen lynchings happen in India where Muslims have been targeted after having been accused of either eating beef or selling cows to be consumed. We continue to see Muslims being targeted under the narrative of love jihad, that they are trying to seduce Hindu women with the goal of converting them. And that again has led to attacks, physical attacks, including murders. You see narratives such as Muslims are trying to convert Hindus through a variety of means, and that has sort of formed the basis of the anti-conversion laws that are being mobilized publicly in various states in India. So the thing I want to point out here, Devarajan, is the ways in which these articulations on digital media are then connected to the political landscape and the everyday organizing of politics. So, sometimes when we do our analysis of digital media, we tend to treat them as if these are entities or ecosystems that exist within themselves. But I think what we need to do when we look at phenomena such as Hindutva and the role of digital media is to connect the digital, the online with the offline. And because that happens in two ways, the online mobilizes the offline, but also the online is supported by an entire infrastructure that is offline. But also that this digital hate is actually mobilized by mainstream politics. And this is a key point because, most Hindutva ideologues in the mainstream, including politicians, will, when you point out that this hate on social media, they will say that, oh, those are fringe groups or those are fringe elements. But if you look at Modi, for instance, you'll see something that is quite telling, which is that when this kind of digital media hate is being mobilized, when the lynchings have happened, he wouldn't utter a word about it. He wouldn't say anything about it as the prime minister of the country. But also, you have members of the ruling party actually then uttering hate speech or being connected to actors uttering hate speech on social media. So in that sense, the political and the mainstream of the political is very much connected to the digital and the infrastructure of hate on the digital.
Earlier, you mentioned the Indian diaspora. Beyond India itself, controversies about Hindu nationalism have spilled into this group as well. In your view, how has this affected diasporic Indian communities, both Hindu and non-Hindu?
You talked about me experiencing attacks here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And that came about because of a white paper I had written on cultural Hindutva and Islamophobia. And the context of that work was, a broader project on experiences of racism in New Zealand, where I was hearing from Indian Muslims and Sikhs within the Indian diaspora community that were talking about their experiences with Hindutva and with Hindutva hate, and actually then not having spaces where their voices could be heard. So, something within the context of New Zealand that has been quite powerful to observe is the ways in which the Hindutva narratives that you see in India are very much present on the digital architecture of Hindutva here in Aotearoa. And that actually makes lives of Indian minorities quite insecure. In fact, I've had participants in my research work come up and said that, in New Zealand, not only are we experiencing the effects of Islamophobia that are tied to white supremacy. I mean, you think about the Christchurch terror attack, and that really was driven by Islamophobia. So there are strong currents of that here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and that's felt by Muslims. But then, for Indian Muslims or for Muslims from the Indian diaspora, that is then further compounded by Hindutva Islamophobia that is directed at Indian minorities. So, I had a participant tell me that, it seems like you can't escape from the hate of Hindutva, even here in New Zealand. Similarly, I have had Sikh community members point out that, the Hindutva narratives that were being organized to portray Sikhs as terrorists, labeling them as Khalistani, particularly in the backdrop of the farmer protests that were taking place, in protest of sort of neoliberal policies, free market driven policies that were being pushed by the Modi government. And in that backdrop, as farmers who were predominantly Sikhs were protesting, the Sikhs were portrayed as terrorists and labeled Khalistanis. So that narrative was very much playing out here in New Zealand and also in Australia. There is a real aspect of violence in the diaspora in that kind of sense. But then also, if you think about other aspects of Hindutva, which are the day-to-day aspects of marginalization, the day-to-day aspects of disenfranchisement, those also are at work. So say, for instance, you hear narrative accounts of Dalits, oppressed caste communities, talk about the ways in which the caste infrastructure plays out and is promoted by Hindutva organizations. In that sense, even here in the diaspora, there is this real impetus for asserting the monotheism of Hindutva. So for you to be a Hindu, you cannot dissent. You have to fall into line and sort of voice the prescriptions of Hindutva for you to belong in the community. So, in that sense as well, it becomes really difficult within the Hindu community to articulate alternative, diverse, or plural viewpoints because you quickly find yourself to be a target.
So, having discussed the effects of Hindutva on people in India and overseas, what has been the response of Indians who support the preservation of a secular society?
I think one of the most beautiful things in the midst of ascendance of Hindutva globally is the pushback it has received. I think that there are many Indians, including many Hindus, who have stood up and said, not in my name, that this kind of hate being organized in the name of Hinduism needs to be challenged. So you have organizations like Hindus for Human Rights that have been formed precisely with this idea. And in fact, one of the articulations within that context is that if Hindutva has taken Hinduism onto the streets to mobilize this kind of hate, then everyday peace-loving Hindus must stand up, be counted, and must also need to take to the streets in order to challenge the hate politics of Hindutva. So within the broader context of Hinduism, you have seen vigorous challenges being offered to the Hindutva. In fact, the Dismantling Global Hindutva Conference that brought up sort of so much angst among Hindutva ideologues was supported by many Hindu organizations, who wanted to come out and say that this mobilization of hate in the name of Hinduism is not really Hinduism. It is actually a threat to the plural, diverse, syncretic traditions of Hinduism, and that needs to be challenged. But also within this context, there has been a space for debate to really be opened up, and that debate to ask questions such as, is Hinduism really all that syncretic? So within that space, while you have people who say that Hinduism is diverse, Hinduism is pluralistic, there are others that say that, Hinduism is also very much part of this deeply unequal structure that, caste system and its inequalities are very much part of Hinduism. And in fact, Hindutva draws on certain tenets of Hinduism in order to propel this kind of hate. And that has really brought up fascinating arguments and counter arguments. And I think that really is the point, that for any religion or spiritual traditions, that there ought to be that space for arguments, for counter arguments, for debates and conversations to take place, which is basically antithetical to the monotheistic ideology of Hindutva. At the same time, something else we have seen happen is Indian minorities, particularly Muslims and Sikhs in the Indian diaspora, have been speaking out, have been vocal about pointing out the sort of the flows of Hindutva and the effects of Hindutva on their everyday lives. And I think that's really vital, because India, what's been happening is that the voices of Indian minorities have been silenced. So within that context, minorities organizing and mobilizing in the diaspora becomes an important register for supporting the movements within India. Something else also you've seen happen in the midst of this kind of deep consolidation of power by the authoritarian forces of Hindutva is the resistance that has emerged to it. So, something that happened in 2019 and then, in early 2020 before sort of COVID, and then, India went into the lockdown, was, the Modi-led BJP government had come up with citizenship-related policies, the National Register of Citizens and the Citizenship Amendment Act, which really were meant to disenfranchise India's Muslims, because together they are crafted in such a way that um, that process of demonstrating your citizenship and what makes you a citizen is patterned to exclude India's Muslims. So in the backdrop of that, you saw something powerful happen in India, which is sort of you saw Muslim-led democratic, peaceful protests across the country, particularly protests that were led by Muslim women. One might say, and many scholars have said this was one of the most powerful moments in post-independence India of Muslim-led participation in dissent, in taking back the idea of democracy. So, this also then demonstrates for us, I think, a powerful picture in terms of any kind of authoritarian power consolidation, which is that from the heart of authoritarianism can arise dissent, can arise protest and resistance to it, and particularly in dismantling its efforts at consolidating power.
In your research, have you found differences between how the Hindi-speaking parts of India and the non-Hindi-speaking parts of India deal with Hindutva?
So, one of the things is that Hindutva's primary base, if you will, is the Hindi-speaking portion of India. So it is largely northern India and then western India, but at least in its contemporary moment. Now, within that context then, the organizing of Hindutva as we see now is around the consolidation of Hindi, around the organizing of Hindi to perpetuate this narrative of Hindutva hegemony. This has then been connected to series of policy responses, such as the imposition of Hindi in sort of this colonial way across communities in India. Having said that, Devarajan, I want to talk also about the complicity of diverse communities of India into this largely Hindi-led Hindutva, if you will. So let me talk, for instance, of Bengal. The part of linguistic community I come from, and I understand that context. So, Bengalis typically have this orientation to Hindutva that, in Bengal, for majority of the 3 decades of the left front governance, Hindutva really didn't have much space at all. And then, since the TMC came to power, Hindutva has gradually crept in, but even in the most recent elections, in spite of pouring in a vast amount of their resources into Bengal, the BJP wasn't able to win in Bengal. So, Bengalis look at this and sort of outcome and go, well, Bengal and its secular ethos doesn't lend itself to Hindutva. But I think that's where we also need to critically interrogate, because if you think about the history of Hindutva and with Hindu Mahasabha and ideologues like Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, these were Bengalis. If you think about the riots around partition and sort of the organizing of hate around those riots, that did happen in Bengal. So we have to be mindful of that. And similarly, I've been also struck by the ways in which, say, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, these are southern states, have been organized into this hate politics of Hindutva in different ways. So not in the Hindiized narrative, in different ways, but very much within this infrastructure of upper caste, Brahminical infrastructure of Hindutva. So if you look at, some of the most prominent Hindutva ideologues, you have someone like Tejaswi Surya, who is a politician from Bangalore, a southern state, articulating, in fact, just recently he had delivered this speech and he said that, really for there to be peace in the region, Hindus must go and reconvert Muslims even in Pakistan, and then he had to, because of the pushback, he had to take back that statement. But nevertheless, that tells us about the spread of Hindutva across India. But then you also look at the state of Kerala, where Hindutva once again has been trying to seed itself, but again, led by a left front government, it has also gotten significant pushback. So I think within that context, if you think about India more broadly, the question really is tied to what are the communities where Hindutva has been pushed back and what kinds of strategies have been put into place in pushing it back. And I think one of the things that you see there, whether it is in Bengal or in Kerala, at least in the recent elections, it is the ability to craft this narrative of pluralism, this narrative of diversity, but do it in a way that actually points to these ideas as the essence of India, right? And to be able to capture people's imagination with that. And I think, so if you think about the long-term strategy of how you counter Hindutva, building from your question, we have things to learn from these diverse spaces, which is that how are you going to challenge this monotheism of Hindutva by actually making pluralism desirable value once again, which is something which is at the heart of what India is.